time, in its irresistible and ceaseless flow, carries along on its flood all created things, and drowns them in the depths of obscurity, no matter if they be quite unworthy of mention or most noteworthy and important. This is EuroHistory Hub.
Hi, I'm Andrew, and welcome to the second episode of EuroHistory Hub. Today we're diving deep into the very foundations of Europe, its environment and its prehistory, exploring how the land shaped the people and vice versa. We're drawing heavily from Norman Davies' fantastic book, Europe, A History. This is just the start of our journey through millennia of European history, focusing today on the stage itself, the Peninsula.
And I'm Elizabeth. We're thrilled to guide you through the rich and captivating story of Europe's past. Follow us for more episodes and exciting content coming soon. Our goal here is really to pull out the key insights, maybe some surprising facts from Davies' work, giving you a shortcut to understanding how these early factors, the geography, the first peoples, influenced everything that came later. Okay, so let's get started. When we think about Europe, there's often this historical view, you find it in thinkers like Montesquieu even, that Europe's environment somehow, destined it for greatness. Like the climate itself made Europeans superior.
Yeah, the sort of empire of climate idea.
Yeah.
For ages, Europeans genuinely believed their land gave them a unique advantage.
But that's something we need to challenge right off the bat, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, modern geographers, they wouldn't even call Europe a full continent. It's technically a subcontinent of Eurasia. Davies puts it nicely, calls it a cape of the old continent, a western appendix of Asia.
A western appendix, I like that. But despite that, it has this really unusual structure.
It really does. It's got these deep ocean-flooded depressions. Think of the North Sea feeding into the Baltic or the Mediterranean connecting to the Black Sea. They form these parallel sea chains cutting way into the landmass.
And the effect of that is pretty staggering. An incredibly high ratio of shoreline to actual land. We're talking a coastline almost as long as the Earth's equator.
Exactly. So for early people, that meant access. You were almost never that far from the sea or a major waterway connected to it.
Plus, the climate is unusually mild for how far north it is.
Right, thanks to the Gulf Stream. So you get this variation, mild and damp in the north, warm, dry, sunny in the south, more continental in the center and east.
Which sounds pretty ideal for early farming and settlement.
It really was. It favored primitive agriculture. You had plenty of forests, varied lands for raising animals. It just gave early humans a really good setting to adapt and, thrive.
Now, speaking of those early humans, historically, people tried to categorize Europeans using really superficial things like skin color, height, race.
And that's been completely overturned by modern science, hasn't it?
Totally. Now we have genetic analysis, blood groups, DNA, things unheard of not long ago.
And this research is now a respectable field. It shows how much genetic material we all share, but also reveals the sheer variety within Europe right from the start. Those old ideas of Nordic versus Mediterranean. Genetics shows complex patterns, and interestingly, they often correlate with language groups. It's like genetics, peoples, and languages evolved together, diverged in tandem. We're just starting to read those ancient messages.
So this varied environment, it wasn't paradise, but it wasn't impossibly harsh either. Davies calls it a stimulating blend of opportunity and challenge. How did that kind of, manageable difficulty shape things?
Well, it seems to have fostered enterprise, flexibility. You had predictable seasons, which encourages planning, routine. But then you also had unpredictable weather shifts, demanding people adapt. So it wasn't easy, but it provided this constant push, this fertile ground for innovation and sustained development. Maybe more so than some other early cradles of civilization in, say, subtropical river valleys.
And the physical layout itself, it almost seems to invite movement, doesn't it? Mountains aren't impossibly high. The distances aren't vast like in Asia.
Exactly. It's like an invitation. You could travel along coasts, float down rivers flowing in all sorts of directions. Seenely, Rhine north, Rhone south, Tagus west, Danube east. And crucially, there were lots of easy porterages.
Porterages?
Yeah, short land crossings connecting different river systems. So think about it. You could haul a boat a short distance, say between the Dvina and the Dnieper rivers, and potentially travel from near Sweden all the way towards Egypt.
Wow. So travel across Europe could be surprisingly quick.
Weeks, maybe even days for some routes. Compare that to the Silk Road across Asia that could take over a year. It's a huge difference in connectivity.
Okay, so that brings us to thinking about Europe in terms of its main physical parts. The plains, the mountains, seas, peninsulas, islands. Davies suggests this is a safer way to divide it up than using cultural gradients.
Yeah, cultural lines shift, they're fuzzy, but the physical geography, That's remained remarkably constant. Political borders come and go, but the mountains and plains stay put.
And the biggest feature has to be the Great European Plain.
Undoubtedly, it dominates. Stretches 2,400 miles, Atlantic to the Urals. And key thing about it, it lacks clear natural boundaries in many areas.
Which had consequences, right?
Big ones. Peoples living there, like in France, Prussia, Russia, they had to develop strong, systematic military organizations for defense and expansion. It became the stage for these huge, decisive battles. Waterloo, Stalingrad, you name it.
And within that plain, Ukraine stands out. The name itself means on the edge.
Like a frontier land. It's incredibly rich minerals, probably Europe's best farmland. But strategically, it's the main overland route between Asia and Europe.
Which has made it contested ground for centuries.
Tragically so. As Davies points out, Ukrainians rarely controlled their own destiny. Caught between empires Ottoman, Polish, Russian, the 20th century was just brutal. Wars, Stalin's collectivization, the terror famine. The human cost is staggering, maybe 20 million lives lost. They really only regained their independence and, well, a free voice after 1991. It's a stark reminder of the human toll on that vast plain.
And south of the main mountains, there's another key plain, the Pannonian Plain, modern Hungary.
Right. That stretch of grassland was crucial. It was a natural stopping point for nomadic groups coming from the east and a perfect launch pad for barbarian tribes heading towards the Roman Empire.
Okay, let's turn to the mountains, the backbone of Europe, basically.
Pretty much. That big chain curving from the Alps to the Carpathians. It creates the watershed, dividing the northern rivers from the southern ones.
Barriers, obviously, but also unifying.
In a way, yes. The distances aren't that immense. Once people figured out how to cross the high passes regularly, the lands on either side often developed links, even shared cultures to some extent.
And the gaps in the mountains become super important pathways, like the Moravian Gap.
Absolutely vital. Between the Bohemian Massif and the Carpathians. It saw the first Slav state. Countless armies marched through it, leading eventually towards Vienna, what Davies calls the heart of Europe.
What about life in the mountains, those high alpine valleys?
You might think they'd be isolated and tough, but initially they were great places to settle. Sunshine, water, wood for fuel, and natural defense. Remote communities, like the Swiss cantons, could thrive independently for centuries.
But that changed.
It did, with modern communications in the 19th century. Suddenly, these remote valleys weren't an advantage anymore. People started leaving in droves. Davies mentions this old Savoyard complaint. My goat is always going up and my wife going down. A bit sad, really.
Thinking about mountain crossings, the St. Gothard Pass sounds like it was incredibly important. Europe's most vital artery, connecting Germany and Italy.
Yeah, but interestingly, the Romans didn't really use it. There was this impassable gorge, the Scholinen Gorge. It wasn't until around 1200 AD that engineering work started, including the famous Devil's Bridge.
Then that opened it up.
Big time. For about 600 years, it was the main north-south route, though still a very tough climb. Its opening changed strategic calculations for armies. Then came the railway tunnel in 1882 and the motorway tunnel in 1980, massive engineering projects. Near the Devil's Bridge today, there's actually a monument to Russian soldiers under General Suvorov, who made a famous crossing in 1799, a symbol of European connections and just the sheer scale of the Alps.
Let's move to the seas and islands. The Mediterranean, often called the cradle of the classical world.
That marvelously secluded sea. It became a Roman lake for a while. But what's really striking, as Davies points out, is that since the Roman Empire fell, it has never been politically united again.
Why is that? Why didn't sea power lead to unity there?
It seems land-based empires always held the upper hand. And once Islam established itself across North Africa and the Levant, the sea became a permanent dividing line, an area of conflict. And Davies notes, looking forward, that demographic shifts in North Africa could really change the balance of power around the Mediterranean in the future.
And the other enclosed seas, the Baltic and the Black Sea. Similar stories?
Broadly, yes. Unique histories, lots of rivalries between coastal powers, meaning no single power ever totally dominated either sea for long. And the Black Sea has that really weird feature.
The lifeless depths.
Exactly. So much hydrogen sulfide means the deeper waters are anoxic, basically dead. The largest mass of lifeless water in the world. Quite something.
So if controlling the seas themselves was hard, the gateways became crucial.
Hugely influential. The states controlling Gibraltar, the Dardanelles connecting the Med to the Black Sea, and the Danish Sound controlling entry to the Baltic, they held immense power.
Especially the Danish Sound, Europe's jugular vein.
Literally. The only way into the Baltic, The Danes collected sound dues, basically a toll, for centuries, made them very wealthy and powerful. Until Britain's navy became dominant, and eventually the dues were ended. Later, canals like the Kiel Canal bypassed it anyway. And today, with air power, these narrow sea passages, even the English Channel, just don't have the same strategic chokehold they once did.
What about the landmass itself? Europe has these big sub-peninsulas.
Right, Scandinavia, Iberia, Spain, and Portugal. Italy, maybe the most perfect peninsula, as Davies says, and the Balkans. They're attached to the mainland, but often easier to get to by sea. And then you have, well, thousands of islands.
10,000, according to Davies.
Wow. And the bigger ones, like Britain or Ireland or Sicily, obviously developed very distinct cultures, distinct histories. Britain, from its island base, built this enormous global empire.
But, as Davies says, insularity is shrinking fast.
It really is. Naval power isn't what it was.
Yeah.
Air power, missiles, they make islands less secure. And things like the Channel Tunnel, opened in 1994, that wasn't just symbolic. Davies calls it the end of Britain's island history. A profound shift.
Okay, let's zoom in on 3 specific areas that became important because of their location bridgelands, where cultures met. The Midi, the Danube Basin, the Volga Corridor.
Good choices. They show how geography channels interaction.
So, the Midi of the south of France, why was that so key?
It was basically the easiest way to get from the Mediterranean world up to the great European plain in the north. So it became this vital zone for mixing the ancient civilizations of the south, meeting the so-called barbarian cultures of the north. That fusion was fundamental to the development of what became France, a real melting pot.
And the Danube Basin.
Similar idea, linking different zones, but more west to east. The Danube River itself flows 1,500 miles from Germany's Black Forest to the Black Sea. For the Romans, it was a major frontier separating civilization from barbarity. It became a major highway, a boulevard linking west and east, the heartland of the Habsburg Empire, and also a major zone of conflict between Christian Europe and the Ottoman Empire.
The river's journey is like a tour through European culture and history.
It really is. Starts in Germanic lands, passes Vienna, where Metternich supposedly said Europe meets Asia, divides Hungary, separates the different Slav groups, and as you go downstream, you move from predominantly Catholic areas into Orthodox Christian lands. Huge cultural shifts marked right there on the riverbanks. Finally, it ends in that vast natural delta on the Black Sea.
And the third bridgeland, the Volga Corridor.
Europe's biggest river. And by modern convention, the Volga often marks the boundary between Europe and Asia. For a long time, up until maybe the 17th century, it also marked the eastern limit of settled Christian communities. So a major cultural boundary as well as a geographical one.
It's easy to think of the environment as static, but of course it changes. Climate shifts over time.
Massively. Historical climatology is fascinating. People like Ellsworth Huntington studied California redwood tree rings. They give a record going back thousands of years. He developed this pulsatory theory, suggesting climate phases influence the rise and fall of civilizations.
And we can track this with surprising precision now, can't we?
We can. Tree rings, layers and stalagmites, glacier movements, but also human records. Davies highlights French wine harvest dates vendange. They kept records for centuries.
So early harvest meant a warm, sunny year.
Exactly. Late harvest, a cool, poor year. These wine harvest curves match up really well with other climate data. They clearly show things like the Little Ice Age in Europe, the absolute worst year for French vineyards, 1816. Grapes weren't picked until November 1st.
And 1816 was the year without a summer.
The very same, caused by the Tambora volcanic eruption the year before. Miserable weather across Europe. And famously, that's the summer Mary Shelley, stuck indoors in Switzerland, wrote Frankenstein. A direct link between climate history and cultural history.
Beyond climate, there's historical ecology, looking at how humans have changed the landscape.
Right, a newer field using really cool techniques. Aerial photography reveals ancient field patterns, sediment analysis shows soil erosion, pollen analysis reconstructs past vegetation. We're not just digging up objects, we're trying to piece together entire past ecosystems and how humans interacted with them.
Okay, so trying to organize this vast sweep of prehistory. The standard model is the 3-age system.
Correct. Stone, bronze, iron. Developed by a Danish curator back in 1836 based on the main materials used for tools and weapons. Simple, but useful as a basic framework.
But it's not a strict timeline, is it?
No, definitely not. It's about technological stages, not fixed dates. One region could still be in the Stone Age, while another was well into the Bronze Age. And the timescales are immense. The Old Stone Age, the Paleolithic, goes back maybe 1 million years, covering the Ice Ages.
And produced some incredible art. Those early Venus figurines, Willendorf, Lossel, and the cave paintings, Altamira, Lascaux.
Stunning stuff. Suggests complex beliefs, maybe early religion. And the materials used often came from far away, hinting at surprisingly wide trade networks, even back then.
Davies raises an interesting question about hunter-gatherers.
He does. Instead of asking why they adopted farming, maybe we should ask why they ever gave up hunting and gathering. For millennia, it seems they had a pretty secure life, arguably more leisure time. They knew about farming, but often chose not to do it. What changed?
And those Venus figurines, like the one from Lossel, they're mostly female figures, aren't they?
Overwhelmingly. The Venus of Lossel, dated around 19,000 BC, really emphasizes female characteristics. It's led to theories about early European societies perhaps being matriarchal, centered on a great cosmic mother.
Some interpretations even suggest warrior women, like the Amazons of legend.
There's some archaeological evidence that challenges traditional assumptions. Graves containing female skeletons buried with weapons, battle axes. It forces us to rethink prehistoric gender roles. It's not all clear-cut.
We also get these incredible glimpses into individual lives from things like the bog bodies.
Like Tolen Man in Denmark, yeah. Preserved so perfectly in the peat bog, the tannins basically mummified him. Scientists could analyze his last meal, diseases he might have had. Amazing detail. Provides these little snapshots, though you always have to be careful about fakes or misinterpretations.
Now we have the engineering marvels, like Stonehenge.
Absolutely mind-boggling. Those huge blue stones weighing over 50 tons, dragged all the way from South Wales. How did they do that? And the alignment is so precise, people thought it was some kind of astronomical calculator.
And carvings there seem to link to the Mediterranean.
Yeah, shapes resembling daggers or axes found in Mycenaean Greece.
Yeah.
It suggests direct contact somehow between Britain and the Age and Bronze Age world. Incredible.
So after the Paleolithic, we get the Mesolithic, Middle Stone Age, a transition period.
Right, adapting as the climate warmed up after the last ice age. People settled more, often near water. Then comes the really big shift, the Neolithic Revolution. Exactly. The move from gathering food to producing it. Agriculture. Domesticating animals, making pottery. It didn't just change diet, it changed everything. Society, settlement, population density.
And spread across Europe.
Seems to have come from the Middle East, spreading in two main waves. One group, using distinctive linear pattern pottery, moved up the Danube Valley. Another group, with different pottery styles, spread around the Mediterranean coasts. By about 3200 BC, farming had pretty much reached most of Europe.
And we know a surprising amount about their daily lives from sites like the lake villages in Switzerland.
Oh, those are fantastic finds. The waterlogged conditions preserved organic materials incredibly well. Wood, textiles, food remains. Davies mentions finding even half-eaten apples. You get a real sense of everyday life thousands of years ago.
Wheat became the staple crop for Europe, didn't it?
Largely, yes. And that choice had deep consequences. Wheat cultivation, originally from the Middle East, might have influenced European physical stature, social structures. Davies even links it to warmongering and imperialism, because wheat farming is seasonal. You have intense periods of work, planting and harvesting, but then periods of downtime. That leisure time, he argues, could be turned to other pursuits, like warfare. It's a provocative idea.
After the Neolithic, there's a transition phase, Chalcolithic, then the Bronze Age.
Right. Bronze, that alloy of copper and tin, marks another technological leap. This era sees the rise of more complex societies, maybe early cities, the beginnings of writing in some areas, specialized crafts, much wider trade networks. The high points were places like Mycenae in Greece and Knossos on Crete, often called Europe's first civilization.
It's interesting how things like counting systems developed too. Davies mentions a theory linking the spread of Indo-European languages and the decimal system, base 10, with a group called the Beaker folk.
Yeah, those complex Celtic languages, for instance, used a base 20 system. You still see echoes of it in French numbers like 80, 4 20s for 80.
And our modern system, base 10 with 0, actually came much later to Europe, didn't it?
Much later. It originated in India, traveled through the Arab world, and didn't become common in Europe until around the 13th century AD. Took a while to catch on.
But the Bronze Age world didn't last forever. There was a collapse.
A major one. Around 1200 BC, something happened. Maybe climate change, invasions, internal strife, likely a combination. But across the eastern Mediterranean and into Europe, trade networks broke down, cities were abandoned, palaces destroyed. A general systems collapse, as archaeologists call it. A dark age followed for many regions.
Paving the way for the Iron Age.
Exactly. Ironworking seems to have spread from the Hittites in Anatolia. In Europe, this leads to cultures like the Hallstatt and later Latin periods, characterized by powerful warrior elites, hill forts, sophisticated metalwork, still extensive trade.
And the Latin culture is often identified with the Celts.
Widely, yes. Davies calls the Celts the first great nation north of the Alps whose name we know. Linking specific archaeological cultures with language groups is always tricky, but the association between Latin and Celtic speakers is pretty strong.
Which brings up the whole Indo-European question.
Oh, that's one of the biggest puzzles in prehistory. It started back in 1786, when Sir William Jones noticed striking similarities between Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek. That revealed this vast Indo-European language family stretching from India to Ireland.
But where did it originate? The Indo-European homeland?
That's the million-dollar question. Lots of theories. One prominent one, by Maria Gimbutas, links it to the Kurgan culture, horse-riding pastoralists from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, roughly modern Ukraine and southern Russia, who expanded outwards. But it's still debated. The exciting thing now is combining linguistic evidence with genetic studies, seeing if language spread matches patterns of gene flow.
We can also read history in the landscape itself through place names.
Absolutely. Place names are like fossils in the language. Rivers, hills, towns, their names often preserve traces of the people who lived there long ago. You find Celtic roots for words related to water or hills across huge swaths of Europe, then layers of Roman, Germanic, Slavonic, Norse names on top.
And town names, nation names, they reflect history too, but can also be sources of conflict.
Definitely. Names carry identity and power. If it Derry or Londonderry, Antwerpen or Anvers. These aren't just trivial variations, they represent deep historical and political divisions. Historians have to be really aware of that, sensitive to the different perspectives locked within a name.
All this deep history brings us, as Davies puts it, to the terminus of Europa's ride, the island of Crete and the Minoan civilization.
Europe's first great civilization flourishing in the Bronze Age. Picture Crete around, say, 1628 BC. It was a maritime power, a seaborne empire. They had sophisticated towns with palaces like Knossos, amazing frescoes, running water, complex rituals like bull leaving.
And their palaces weren't fortified.
Mostly not, which suggests they felt pretty secure, confident in their sea power, wealthy, artistic, seemingly peaceful for a long time.
What about their religion?
Seems to have centered on a powerful female deity, a great earth goddess, often identified with Rhea from later Greek myth. Rituals involve bulls, maybe ecstatic ceremonies, snakes, and, Davies points out, evidence suggests that in times of extreme crisis, they even practiced human sacrifice.
And the male figures in their art are different.
Yeah, often depicted as youthful, athletic, but not in the sort of dominant, heroic warrior style we see later in Greece. It raises interesting questions about gender roles, maybe a transition from an earlier matriarchy towards more patriarchal societies focused on warfare.
And Crete is woven into Greek mythology. Zeus, born there, the Minotaur in the labyrinth, Theseus, Daedalus flying.
Those myths clearly reflect the memory of Minoan Crete's power and influence over the mainland Greek communities in the Bronze Age. They were paying tribute, likely, to this sophisticated island kingdom.
But this flourishing civilization faced catastrophe.
It did. The big one was the eruption of the volcano on the island of Thera, modern Santorini, probably around 1628 BC. A truly colossal event, one of the biggest eruptions in recorded history.
How big?
Huge. Blew maybe 30 cubic kilometers of rock and ash into the sky, caused massive climate disruption, and crucially for Crete, it triggered enormous tsunamis that would have devastated the northern coast, where many Minoan settlements and ports were.
And there's that chilling discovery on Crete itself, related to the eruption.
Yes, at a mountain shrine near Knossos, archaeologists found evidence of human sacrifice, seemingly in progress, interrupted suddenly by an earthquake associated with the Thera eruption. A young man, a priest with a bronze knife, frozen in time at a moment of terror and ritual.
Did Thera destroy Minoan civilization outright?
Probably not Knossos itself directly, but the tsunamis, the ash fall, the disruption to trade and agriculture, it must have been devastating. Davies argues it delivered the first of the blows that severely weakened the Minoans, making them vulnerable to later disruption and eventually invasion and takeover by Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland.
The end of Europe's first civilization. It makes you think about the rise and fall of civilizations generally.
It really does. Can things like catastrophe theory or chaos theory which described sudden shifts in natural systems, apply to human societies too. Long periods of stability, then sudden collapse. For archaeologists looking at the big picture, the Minoan-Mycenaean Bronze Age collapse marks the end of the first great cycle of European history.
The first of three.
That's how Davies frames it. Cycle 1 is the prehistoric Bronze Age world. Cycle 2 is the classical world of Greece and Rome. And Cycle 3 is modern Europe, emerging after Rome's fall, the one we're still technically in.
Which brings a rather sobering thought.
Davies writes, Europe itself, which once was strong, is now weaker. He was writing in the late 20th century, thinking about things like the Cold War, Chernobyl, but also the hopes raised by the fall of the Berlin Wall.
It leaves us pondering our own cycle, doesn't it? Are we heading for decline, invasion by new barbarians, catastrophe, or maybe something else?
Or maybe, as Davies speculates, perhaps they will live to see the last golden summer of late European the Fieth. It's a powerful, open-ended question to leave hanging.
Wow. Well, that was an incredible journey through Europe's deep environmental and prehistoric past. It really underscores how the land itself, the climate, the movements of early peoples laid the groundwork for everything that followed.
Absolutely. You see how geography enabled certain kinds of societies, certain kinds of interactions, certain kinds of conflicts, these very ancient patterns, the legacy of the landscape and those first inhabitants, they still echo, often in ways we don't even realize.
So as you go about your day, maybe think about that. How much of Europe's story, its destiny perhaps, was already being sketched out thousands of years ago by its mountains, its rivers, its plains, and the people learning to live there? The layers of history are truly right there beneath our feet.
A fascinating thought to end on.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.